Hello, I'm Connor Lifson, and this is TABLEWORK, a TAPS podcast series where we interview the artists and theater makers behind our productions on what it takes to get their productions from the page to the stage. This episode features Pauline Mornet, a second-year PhD student in TAPS. Join us as she talks about her upcoming production of Wanderers, which is part of the TAPS Graduate Repertory Series. Wanderers opens February 6th in the Nitery Theater. Hi, Pauline. I am thrilled to be in conversation with you about your upcoming show, Wanderers. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Connor.
I wonder if we could just start off by you telling me a little about the project you're working on.
Yeah, so we have been working for the last 7 weeks on devising a performance called Wanderers. Devising meaning that it was a very collaborative process with my cast. We're 4 actors, movers, and sound makers. So we have a guitarist and a drummer. And the research question that we started out this project with was, what are the processes of resilience that emerge when faced with uprootedness?
Can you talk a little bit about where that question came from?
Yeah, so we've been thinking a lot about this question of origins and this pursuit of origins, um, and this emphasis that is given to people on where they come from. And so we were thinking about what is that process of thinking through this question of origins, especially when many of us have experienced instances of uprootedness. And so I was thinking about that affective moment when one encounters uprootedness and what that makes to one's reality. And my conclusion was one of extreme surrealism and absurdity that emerges when things suddenly don't look quite like they used to. And the theater is a great space to explore these kinds of visuals or aesthetics, right? So we've been using blocks that move around the stage, and everything is quite malleable. Our costumes are extremely interpretive. So
Sounds like a really fun time to be in the room. Devising, I've done devising as well, and it's such a kind of unpredictable process at times, especially when you're starting off with just a question or just an image, and you don't have a text to turn back to, and maybe not an outline or guidepost to look back to as you're making. Um, and my experience has always been one of a ton of surprises. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about either a particular surprise or kind of a diffuse way that surprise has been factoring into your process.
yeah, that's a really good question. And I did have in the back of my mind two sort of seminal texts that I was referring to in moments of doubt, as you said. The first was Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, which I think is a profoundly misunderstood book. I think it's one about it's often referred to as this kind of like trippy LSD experience, but I actually think it is about that moment in childhood when your phonetic understanding of language gets broken. You realize that your phonetic understanding of language isn't actually how words are being used. Like there's a
Mm.
disjunction in growing up. Um, and so, I hold that book dearly in my heart, and I was happy to have it, in my back pocket. And then another book is a more contemporary one, which is Flights by Olga Torkatsu. She was the Nobel Prize winner for literature. That book came out in 2007, and it's a series of vignettes about this process of movement and people traveling, um, often not knowing why. And I think the question of what drives people to movement is an unanswered one for her. But she seems to be pulling towards this sort of almost genetic predisposition that some people are more prone to movement. And I like this idea that this idea of movement, like literally like traveling through space, but also movement as like movement in the theater. The
Mm.
fact that we're moved and being moved by each other. And I think to answer the second part of your question, which is what surprised you. I think there was a lot of emphasis at the start on this process of listening, and
Mm.
and to listen to each other and to see how the music will move you, but also the movement will inform the music, um, and also how to keep that sensation of listening like during the performance as well. So because often I think people, when they've repeated gestures enough, such as is the nature of rehearsal, um, they they sort of forget to listen to each other and be surprised.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we hear. I think actors talk all the time about listening to your scene partner and everything, but that's always. I think some of us at least tend to take, myself included, tend to take that in a very literal way, like literally listening to what your scene partner is saying, letting that inform what you're doing. And I'm I'm excited by thinking more broadly about what listening means, like on a physical level as well. Could you tell us about, I don't know if you want to just hone in on one exercise that you've done in rehearsal, but can you give us like a little taste of what your rehearsals have looked like, whether that relates to the listening or not? But I think it'd be fun to hear about what goes on inside a devising process like this.
Okay, well, my process is very particular, and I borrow a lot from Natalie Lovelace's idea of polydisciplinamory, which takes the word polyamory and discipline and combines it. And she has an ethos that research creation should be driven by love and driven by curiosity. So we've started every rehearsal process since the beginning drinking tea.
Mm.
So just like you and I today, we sit around a table, we drink tea, we talk about our day, we talk about our stresses or our concerns, we talk about the things that we love. What may seem completely separate from our work, but I actually think the way that we live, like our performances of everyday life, is what should drive our creations as well. So yeah, we always start this way, and then we'll slowly, when the time comes, move into rehearsal.
And you said slowly. Is that a gradual process of, or is there a time where you, as the
There's
director,
no
have to make the
no
decision of
no
like now we're moving into rehearsal
no
time? No.
time. I think this concept of time is really destructive, actually, for
Mm.
the theater, because, and I had a few experiences where minutes are counted, and I think it's actually it's counterintuitive. Like to be so focused on time actually makes you less whatever productive, or it doesn't actually get you where you want to be. And it was a big challenge of mine was to just like not look at the clock, like no, we're under a time constraint, but rather to peel away from this time obsession. And I think it was very productive.
Mm.
Yeah.
It reminds me. This isn't quite what you're saying, but it reminds me. A directing teacher of mine once told me that if an actor is like talking too fast, if an actor is moving too quickly,
Yeah.
or sorry, yeah, if an actor is moving too quickly, you need to like actually try to speed up sometimes and it'll make you slow down, or vice versa. If a play's moving too slowly, you actually have to try to slow down even more, and that will make things go a little bit quicker, because it's just the way when you get too focused in on how things are moving quickly and how things are moving slowly, if you pay too much attention to the time, then it starts to, like you said, distort the way we think about it.
Yeah.
So there's some of this counterintuitive unlearning that we need to be doing as well.
Totally. Totally.
Shifting gears a little bit, could you, part of the graduate repertory process is working with designers and um, design elements. And I'll ask you a little bit later about collaboration, but I'm curious if there's any particular design or technical elements that, without giving the show away, you could tease us with a little bit here.
Wow, I have to say, costumes was a huge revelation. Um, I started working with Bailey Shekka, who's the costume designer. It's she's a visual artist, and it just has become such a big part of the show. Like the process of creation has been super generative, and I've spent many hours in her studio working on the masks and the costume pieces, and they are just beautiful. Like the pieces themselves, I'd say, are works of art, and it's going to be so exciting to animate them. Like the sorts of materials we're using is organza, which is this very like translucent and very trippy material, and the way that it reflects with light is very
Mm.
unpredictable. Like it can give you like green gleams and whites and yellows, so it's and pinks, so it's gonna look, I'm really excited to see how it looks with the lighting, which is also another big sort of design element of this show. That was a great
Oh,
it's been a great
that's
collaboration.
exciting. And speaking about collaboration, I don't know, maybe you can want to talk about your collaboration with Bailey, but do you feel like you've learned anything about collaboration through this process, or has anything kind of something you thought you believed, you now believe more about what the collaborative process in performance making looks like, particularly in regards to a devising process?
I'm scared that whatever I say will sound like cliche.
I mean, sometimes sometimes that is the world, right?
Oh my
You're like
god.
experiencing something and you get confirmation that the cliche is there for a
Yeah,
reason.
I mean, I'm such an advocate of collaboration in the artistic process. Like, I think you learn so much from working with somebody else and like bouncing ideas from them. And a lot of the time, there was almost a process of confirmation. Like, you're like, what do you think of this? I don't like it. Yeah, me neither. Like it's kind of, there's almost like this feeling of brains being in sync.
Mhm.
Um, which I think is politically super powerful. Like to see each other and to breathe sort of the same air for the duration of a project, these ephemeral, temporal projects that are like theater performances. um I just think is really powerful.
Mm.
And we should be creating, as many spaces as possible to create like these kinds of instances of collaboration.
Yeah, and I love one thing you just said, which is the kind of admitting or acknowledging that an idea we might have had an
Was
hour
bad.
ago was bad, like it
Yeah.
wasn't the right. Like I feel
Yeah.
like sometimes when the tendency when we're centering collaboration and prioritizing collaboration is to just say yes. It's to like take the improv rule and say yes um sometimes that, at least in my experience, sometimes that's kind of taken too far to a fault. And there's a
Mm,
certain kind of trust in a collaborative process where you need to be able to be honest with your collaborator, and
mm,
that's actually the better form of collaboration, to be
mm-hmm.
like, actually no, that's not actually fitting what this thing wants to be.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes that can be like not tense, but there can be like disagreements also. Like even yesterday, my one of the actors, Alice, was saying, "Oh, I want to throw this popcorn around." And I was like, "No,
No popcorn
we
throwing.
cannot throw all of the popcorn around. It will get sticky." um, so I think and a bit, to complicate this idea of like de-hierarchizing these kinds of rehearsal spaces. On one hand, I think it is important that there be a more horizontal organization of power, but I also think that the role of the director still has to exist, that there still needs to be some kind of hierarchy in the process.
Yeah, it's like there's some part of this that I think is true, that especially for people who haven't done devising before, for directors who haven't done devising,
Yeah.
to do that kind of process, I think teaches one a lot about what it means to be a leader in a room. You
Yeah.
learn about different collaborative styles, you learn about how to decenter yourself in the room, but then I think this is exactly what the secret part is, exactly what you just said, which is that you learn also when the room needs a leader, and when the room needs someone to point the right direction,
Mm.
or to point a direction for everyone else to go in as
Yeah.
well.
And I would say, to continue that, what I observed during this particular process, and every process is different because you're working with different people and there's different dynamics and resources, etc., is that people are really responsive if you gave them an explanation for decisions.
Hmm.
Like this whole like, no, because the aura is off. This there's often this sort of what's the word, like stereotype with author directors or whatever. uh, I found this system not to be very productive, but rather to be like, well, actually, I think this because blah blah blah, and justifying your decisions made for a much more cohesive. It takes more, again, time, but it did make for a much more like cohesive project.
Yeah, the one of my teachers has always talked about radical transparency being a
Yeah,
core of the process,
yeah,
and there's a time and place for it, but that's been my experience as well. Is like some taking the extra minute to explain why someone needs to run around in circles for 3 minutes, like makes everyone in the room, I think, believe in the project more,
yeah.
and I think that's one of the most important things about these kinds of processes, is like collective buy-in.
And I think what also should be emphasized is that the people you choose to work with
Hmm.
is critical, because what we're describing is very utopic, but also being really selective in who you choose to work with makes for that sort of utopic experience.
How did you pick who you wanted to work with on
I
this show?
picked my friends. No, the truth is, again, we're working with the resources and the people that are around us. I was having many conversations a year ago about who would be interested in doing a kind of show, a performance that was open and that would be something that would feel good for them, not a chore.
Hmm.
And so I ended up shortlisting a group of people in my surroundings. So the drummer is my neighbor. uh, the guitarist is my one of my best friends, former roommates, and Alice is one of my long-term collaborators. So it's really a gift to be
Hmm.
able to to choose the people you work with. And
That's amazing.
yeah.
Um, so I don't usually ask the question like, what do you want your audience to take away from your show? Because I don't think you can necessarily predict that. So I'll ask instead, like, what kind of experience are you trying to create for your audience? I mean, we've talked a lot about your process, and I imagine a lot of that's going to kind of bleed into the audience experience. But whether this comes from a tonal place or a political place, or any kind of place, like what is how would you describe the kind of experience you're creating here?
I hope that at the very least people have fun. That people come out being like, "Well, that was a hoot."
Yeah.
As this interview illustrates, this has been a real process oriented piece as opposed to final product, and that's kind of the ethos we've carried throughout. Um, but this sensation of surrealism and uprootedness for me is sort of the key sort of image or idea that I want people to come out of it feeling.
Mm.
Um, Truth is we live in a very confusing world, and to make beauty and almost like a romantic idea of this absurdist and surrealist world, I would say is sort of the image.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And an important one, I might add as well.
It's not up to me this one, but I think it's important.
Um, is there anything else that we didn't get to discuss here today that you want to make sure our listeners hear and absorb before they come and see your show?
No, but I do want to thank all the collaborators on this
Yes,
piece.
shout them out.
I want to shout them all out. So Natalia on set design, Bailey on costume design, Jonathan on dramaturgy, and Trini on lighting design has been, as well as the support of the grad department. Uh, big thank you to you all, because it's a big work to put up a show, and everyone has been super supportive and um, professional and totally on it. So I'm very, very grateful for
Hmm.
that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I personally cannot wait to see Wanderers, which will open February 6th in the Nitery Theater. And more details are going to be listed in the podcast description for anyone who wants to snag a ticket. Thank you so much, Pauline, for
Thank
chatting with me today.
thank you, Connor, for your very thoughtful questions.